31st January 1943, Stalingrad. The basement of the Univermag department store reeked of sweat, gunpowder, and despair. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Inside, huddled around a flickering oil lamp, sat Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the first German field marshal in history to surrender. His sunken eyes stared at nothing. His hands trembled not from cold but from the weight of catastrophe. Around him, the remnants of his staff officers sat in silence, their once pristine Wehrmacht uniforms now filthy rags. Somewhere above, Soviet soldiers were closing in. The sound of their boots echoed through the frozen rubble like the footsteps of fate itself. In 72 hours, over 90,000 German soldiers would march into Soviet captivity. Most would never see home again. This was the end of the Sixth Army and the beginning of Germany's long retreat from the East. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done in Paulus's position? Obey Hitler's order to fight to the last man, or surrender to save your soldiers? To understand how Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer, a man who had helped plan Operation Barbarossa itself, ended up a prisoner in Soviet hands, we must go back to the summer of 1942. By then, the war in the East had already devoured millions. Hitler's grand invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941, had stalled in the frozen outskirts of Moscow that winter. The Wehrmacht had suffered nearly 1 million casualties in that first brutal year. Entire divisions had been decimated. The myth of German invincibility had cracked, though Hitler refused to acknowledge it. Now in 1942, the Führer sought a new objective: the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany's war machine was fueled by petroleum, and the Reich's own reserves were critically low. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti could not meet the Wehrmacht's voracious appetite. Hitler needed the Soviet oil fields at Baku, Grozny, and Maikop. Without them, his tanks would become immobile fortresses, his Luftwaffe grounded, his U-boats useless. The entire German war effort depended on securing that oil. But to reach the Caucasus, one city had to fall first: Stalingrad. Stalingrad was more than a city. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, the iron-fisted dictator who ruled the Soviet Union with absolute power. Losing it would be a propaganda catastrophe for the Soviets, a blow to Stalin's personal prestige that could shake the entire communist system. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad meant humiliating his greatest rival, crushing Soviet morale, and opening the gateway to the Caucasus. The city sat on the western bank of the Volga River, a vital artery for Soviet supply routes. Capturing it would cut the Soviet Union in half, severing the flow of oil and resources from the south to the industrial heartlands of the north. Strategically, Stalingrad was a prize worth any price, but Hitler's obsession with the city went beyond strategy. It became personal. He wanted Stalingrad not just conquered but destroyed, erased. And the man he chose to lead this apocalyptic assault was Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus. Paulus was born in 1890 in the town of Breitenau in the German state of Hesse. He came from a modest background. His father was a school teacher and accountant, far removed from the aristocratic junker class that dominated the German officer corps. Yet Paulus carried himself with the bearing of nobility. Tall and slender, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, he looked every inch the Prussian ideal. He was fastidious, almost obsessive about his appearance. Even in the field, he insisted on clean uniforms, polished boots, and proper military etiquette. His subordinates sometimes mocked him for it, calling him our most elegant general. But beneath that polished exterior was a brilliant military mind. Paulus had joined the German army in 1910. Serving as a junior officer during World War I, he survived the trenches of the Western Front, witnessing firsthand the horrors of industrial warfare. After Germany's defeat in 1918, he remained in the military during the turbulent Weimar Republic years, slowly climbing the ranks. He was not a Nazi. He never joined the party, never attended Hitler's rallies, never spouted ideological rhetoric. He was a professional soldier, interested in tactics and logistics, not politics. By 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland and ignited World War II, Paulus had risen to the rank of Major General. He served as Chief of Staff to the 10th Army during the invasion of Poland, then to the 6th Army during the conquest of France in 1940. His organizational skills and strategic acumen caught the attention of the High Command. In 1940, he was promoted to Deputy Chief of the German General Staff under Franz Halder, one of the most powerful positions in the Wehrmacht. In Thai's role, Paulus helped draft the initial invasion plans for Operation Barbarossa, the massive offensive against the Soviet Union. Yet for all his brilliance as a staff officer, Paulus had never commanded troops in battle. He was a theorist, a planner, a man who excelled at organizing supply lines and calculating logistical requirements. He could tell you how many tons of ammunition a division needed per day, how many kilometers a motorized column could cover on a given road network, how long it would take to concentrate forces for an assault. But he had never stood on a battlefield, never made the split-second decisions that determine victory or defeat, never felt the crushing weight of command responsibility when soldiers' lives hang in the balance. This lack of combat experience troubled some of his peers. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected commanders, reportedly remarked that Paulus was a typical staff officer, brilliant on paper, but untested in the field. Others, like General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored warfare, questioned whether Paulus had the ruthless decisiveness required of an army commander. But Hitler, guided by the recommendations of his chief of staff Wilhelm Keidel, decided to give Paulus a chance. In January 1942, Paulus was appointed commander of the 6th Army, one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations. It was a formidable force, over 250,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. The 6th Army had a distinguished record, having fought with distinction in Poland, France, and the early stages of Barbarossa. Now, it would be Paulus's instrument to capture Stalingrad. What Hitler and his generals did not fully appreciate was that Paulus, for all his talents, lacked one crucial quality: the ability to disobey. He was, above all else, an obedient soldier. He had been raised in the Prussian military tradition, where orders from superiors were sacred, where questioning authority was unthinkable. This obedience had served him well throughout his career, earning him promotions and respect. But at Stalingrad, it would prove catastrophic. On 23 August 1942, the 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. It had taken them nearly 3 months to advance from their starting positions near Kharkov, battling through the scorching heat of the Russian summer. The city lay before them, sprawling along the western bank of the Volga for nearly 30 kilometers. It was an industrial powerhouse, home to over 400,000 civilians, with massive factories producing tanks, artillery, and weapons for the Soviet war effort. The day before, on 22 August, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had unleashed hell. Over 600 German aircraft, Heinkel He-111 bombers, Junkers Ju-88s, Stuka dive bombers swarmed over Stalingrad in wave after wave. They dropped incendiary bombs and high explosives, turning the city into a raging inferno. Wooden buildings erupted in flames that spread through entire neighborhoods. Oil storage tanks exploded, sending rivers of burning petroleum flowing through the streets. The air itself seemed to catch fire. Civilians fled in panic toward the Volga, scrambling onto ferries, rafts, anything that floated, desperate to escape to the eastern bank. Many drowned in the chaos. Others were burned alive, trapped in collapsing buildings or caught in the open by falling bombs. By the time the sun set on 23 August, over 40,000 civilians lay dead. The city center was a wasteland of smoldering rubble and twisted metal. The Barricadi gun factory, the Red October steel plant, the Dzержinski tractor factory, All had been reduced to skeletal ruins, their walls blown out, their roofs collapsed. Yet somehow, impossibly, production continued. Soviet workers and soldiers labored side by side, repairing damaged machinery, rolling tanks straight from the assembly lines to the front lines, sometimes only meters away. But the bombing had achieved one critical objective. It had destroyed Stalingrad's infrastructure. Roads were blocked by rubble. Water mains had burst. Power lines hung in tangled masses. The city was no longer a functioning urban center. It was a landscape of ruins, a shattered maze of collapsed buildings, bomb craters, and broken concrete. Paulus surveyed the devastation from his forward command post and felt a grim satisfaction. Surely, he thought, the city was finished. Surely the Soviets would abandon this charred wasteland. How could they possibly defend it? He was about to find out. The Soviet commander defending Stalingrad was General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov, a 42-year-old officer with the face of a bulldog and the temperament to match. Chuikov was short, stocky, with thick features and a permanent scowl. He was not a refined intellectual like Paulus. He had risen through the ranks the hard way, fighting in the Russian Civil War, commanding forces in the Far East, surviving Stalin's paranoid purge that had decimated the officer corps in the late 1930s. Chuikov was a survivor, a brawler, a man who understood that war was not about elegant maneuvers on a map, but about killing the enemy before he killed you. When Chuikov arrived in Stalingrad on 12 September 1942 to take command of the 62nd Army, the situation was desperate. The Germans were already in the city, pushing toward the Volga. Soviet forces were being squeezed into an ever-narrowing strip of land along the riverbank. Supplies had to be ferried across the Volga under constant German fire. Reinforcements arrived exhausted and demoralized, many having never seen combat before. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. But Chuikov had a plan. He understood that the city, despite its destruction, could be turned into a weapon. The rubble created natural defensive positions. Every pile of bricks, every collapsed wall, every bomb crater could be fortified. The Germans had air superiority and superior firepower, but in the ruins of Stalingrad, those advantages meant nothing. Aircraft could not effectively bomb targets when friendly and enemy troops were intermingled in the same building. Artillery was equally useless when the front line was impossible to define. Chuikov realized that the only way to neutralize German advantages was to fight at close range, so close that the Germans couldn't use their support weapons without hitting their own men. He called it hugging tactics. Soviet soldiers were ordered to stay as close to the Germans as possible, sometimes only 10 or 20 meters away, sometimes even closer. In the ruins, soldiers fought across kitchen tables, in stairwells, in cellars and attics. Entire battles were fought over single apartment buildings, with the Soviets holding the upper floors while Germans controlled the ground floor, separated by a few meters of bullet-riddled concrete. Chuikov also instituted a policy of constant counterattacks. Whenever the Germans captured a building, Soviet troops immediately launched a counter-assault to retake it, often the same night. This prevented the Germans from consolidating their gains, from fortifying positions, from ever feeling secure. It was exhausting, brutal warfare, but it worked. The German advance slowed to a crawl. Paulus's Sixth Army advanced into this nightmare. His soldiers, trained for mobile warfare and swift blitzkrieg campaigns, found themselves trapped in a hellscape unlike anything they had experienced. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything in military history. It was not warfare in the traditional sense. It was extermination, street by street, house by house, room by room. German soldiers gave it a name, Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. They learned quickly that the normal rules did not apply here. Moving through streets was suicide. Soviet snipers lurked in every window, every pile of rubble. Instead, soldiers moved through blown-out walls, tunneling from one building to the next, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear each room. Sometimes, combat took place floor by floor in the same building, with Germans controlling the ground floor and Soviets the upper stories, both sides throwing grenades down stairwells and firing through ceilings. One of the most infamous battles took place at a location known as Pavlov's house. It was an ordinary four-story apartment building near the city center, but it had a commanding view of the surrounding area. In late September, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a platoon of about 30 Soviet soldiers occupied the building and fortified it. For 58 days, they held it against repeated German assaults. The Germans threw everything at it: infantry attacks, tanks, artillery, airstrikes. Nothing worked. Pavlov's men turned the building into a fortress, mining the approaches, creating firing positions in every room, and counterattacking any German soldiers who got close. Chuikov later claimed that the Germans lost more men trying to capture Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. Another desperate struggle occurred at the grain elevator, a massive concrete structure near the Volga. In mid-September, fewer than 50 Soviet soldiers, mostly naval infantry, occupied the elevator and held it for 3 days against an entire German division. The Germans surrounded the building and pounded it with artillery, but the thick concrete walls absorbed the punishment. German assault troops fought their way inside, and the battle became a close-quarters nightmare. Soldiers fired at point-blank range in the darkness, bayoneted each other in narrow corridors, bludgeoned each other with rifle butts and entrenching tools. When the grain elevator finally fell on 22 September, only a handful of Soviet defenders remained alive, out of ammunition and barely conscious. The Red October factory became another focal point of savage fighting. The factory complex covered several square kilometers and included machine shops, foundries, smelting furnaces, and assembly halls, all now reduced to ruins but still fiercely defended. Soviet workers fought alongside soldiers, using their knowledge of the factory layout to set ambushes and booby traps. German soldiers advancing through the factory had to contend with hidden snipers, sudden counterattacks from unexpected directions, and the constant fear of being cut off and surrounded. By October, Paulus's Sixth Army had pushed the Soviets back to a narrow strip of land along the Volga, less than a kilometer wide in some places. From his headquarters, Paulus could see the river through his field glasses. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Just a few more pushes, a few more assaults, and Stalingrad would be his. But the cost had been staggering. The Sixth Army had lost over 40,000 men killed or wounded. Entire battalions had been reduced to company strength. Ammunition was running low, and supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers across hostile territory. Worse, Paulus's flanks were dangerously exposed. To the north and south of Stalingrad, the German lines were held not by Wehrmacht troops but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies. These Allied forces were poorly equipped, their morale was low, and their training was inadequate. German officers knew this, and many warned that these flanks represented a critical vulnerability, but Hitler dismissed such concerns. He was fixated on Stalingrad, convinced that one final push would break Soviet resistance. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Soviet intelligence was watching those flanks very carefully, and in the marble halls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin and his senior commanders were planning something audacious. The plan was called Operation Uranus, and it was conceived by two of the most brilliant military minds in the Soviet Union, General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasylovsky. Zhukov was Stalin's most trusted commander, a blunt, ruthless officer who had saved Moscow in 1941 and who would go on to lead the Red Army all the way to Berlin. Vasylovsky was the chief of the General Staff, a meticulous planner with a genius for coordinating large-scale operations. The concept behind Operation Uranus was elegant in its simplicity: a double envelopment. Soviet forces would launch simultaneous offensives from the north and south, smashing through the weak Romanian armies on Paulus's flanks, then swinging inward behind Stalingrad to link up and trap the entire Sixth Army in a giant pocket. It was a classic encirclement maneuver, the kind of tactical masterpiece the Germans themselves had used with devastating effect in the early years of the war at Kiev, Minsk, and Bryansk. Now, the Soviets would turn the tables. But pulling off such an operation required meticulous preparation. Stalin approved the plan in mid-October, and for the next month, the Soviets secretly massed enormous forces north and south of Stalingrad. Over 1 million Soviet troops were assembled, along with 13,000 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft. These forces were moved into position under cover of darkness, hidden in forests and villages, camouflaged to avoid German aerial reconnaissance. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Deception operations were launched to convince the Germans that any Soviet buildup was merely defensive. Paulus and his intelligence officers detected some unusual activity, but they severely underestimated the scale of what was coming. German aerial reconnaissance reported some Soviet troop movements, but the Luftwaffe was overstretched, and many reconnaissance flights were canceled due to bad weather. Moreover, Hitler and his staff refused to believe the Soviets were capable of mounting a major offensive. They were convinced that Soviet forces were exhausted, their reserves depleted, their morale broken. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. The offensive began at 7:30 in the morning on 19 November 1942. The sky was gray and overcast, snow falling lightly. Along the northern front, over 3,500 Soviet guns, howitzers, mortars, Katyusha rocket launchers, opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that shook the earth for miles around. Romanian positions simply disintegrated under the onslaught. Trenches collapsed, bunkers caved in, entire units were wiped out before they could even return fire. 80 minutes later at 8:50 a.m., Soviet tanks rolled forward through the snow and mist. The spearheads consisted of T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks, supported by infantry and motorized cavalry. The Romanian Third Army, already shattered by the bombardment, broke and fled. Some units fought bravely, holding their positions until they were overrun, but most simply ran. Romanian officers tried to rally their men, but it was hopeless. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had advanced over 50 kilometers, smashing a gaping hole in the German front. Paulus received the news with growing alarm. He immediately ordered German panzer divisions to counterattack, but they were spread thin, committed to the fighting inside Stalingrad. The few units available were thrown piecemeal into the battle, but they could not stop the Soviet avalanche. The next day, 20th November, the southern pincer struck. At 10:00 a.m., another massive artillery barrage hammered the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad. Again, the Romanians collapsed. The Soviet 57th and 51st Armies, led by General Nicolae Vadutin, tore through the defenses and raced northward. German units tried to plug the gaps, fighting desperately, but there were too few of them, spread too thin across hundreds of kilometers. On 22nd November, the two Soviet pincers met at the small town of Kalach, about 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. A Soviet tank brigade from the northern force linked up with units from the southern force near a bridge over the Don River. The jaws of the trap had closed. The entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, along with remnants of 2 Romanian divisions, was encircled. Paulus was stunned. At his headquarters in Gumrak, west of Stalingrad, he spread maps across his desk and tried to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. His entire army was surrounded. The pocket measured roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south, an area roughly the size of a large city. Inside that pocket were not just combat troops but thousands of support personnel, supply units, engineers, medical staff, headquarters staff. All told, nearly 300,000 men were trapped. His staff officers urged immediate action. General Hans Hube, commander of the 14th Panzer Corps, argued passionately for an immediate breakout toward the southwest, where German lines still held. Other officers agreed. If the Sixth Army moved quickly, before the Soviets could solidify the encirclement, there was still a chance to fight through. But such a move would mean abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning all the heavy equipment and supplies that couldn't be moved quickly, abandoning the wounded. It would mean retreat, failure, defeat. Paulus drafted a request to higher headquarters asking permission to break out. But before he could send it, a message arrived from Hitler's headquarters, relayed through Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, commander of Army Group B. The message was brief and unambiguous. The Sixth Army will hold its current positions. No retreat. You will form a hedgehog defense and await relief. The Luftwaffe will supply the army by air. Paulus read the message twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. Hold position. In the middle of a Soviet encirclement. It was madness. But the order came directly from the Führer himself. And Paulus, trained his entire life to obey orders from superiors, could not bring himself to disobey. On 24th November, another message arrived, this time directly from Hitler. I know the Sixth Army and its commander, and I know it will fight bravely. Every square meter of ground will be held. The Luftwaffe will supply you until relief forces arrive. Heil Hitler. That message sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. Hermann Göring, the rotund and increasingly delusional head of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that his aircraft could supply the trapped army by air. Göring claimed his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day, food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, everything the Sixth Army needed to survive and fight. It was a fantastical promise, born of ignorance and arrogance. The Luftwaffe had never attempted an airlift of this scale. The largest previous airlift had been at Dmiansk earlier in 1942, where German forces had been supplied for several months. But that pocket had been much smaller, the distances shorter, and the Soviet opposition lighter. At Stalingrad, the conditions were completely different. The pocket was huge. The nearest German airfields were over 200 kilometers away, at Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk. Soviet fighters swarmed the skies. Soviet anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket. Winter weather meant frequent snowstorms, fog, and sub-zero temperatures that grounded aircraft for days at a time. And even in ideal conditions, 500 tons per day was an impossible target. But Hitler believed Göring. Or perhaps Hitler simply wanted to believe because the alternative, ordering Paulus to retreat, admitting that Stalingrad was lost, was unthinkable. And so the decision was made. The Sixth Army would stay. It would hold Stalingrad, it would wait for relief, and it would be supplied from the air. The airlift began on 25th November and was a disaster from the start. The Luftwaffe assembled every available transport aircraft, Junkers Ju-52 trimotor cargo planes, Heinkel He-111 bombers hastily converted to carry supplies, even a few giant Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant transports. Pilots flew in relays, loading their aircraft with CR-8s of ammunition, sacks of bread, barrels of fuel, then flying through blizzards and flak barrages to reach the makeshift airstrips inside the pocket. On the best days, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver 100 to 150 tons of supplies. On average, it was closer to 80 tons. The Sixth Army needed 500 tons per day just to survive and closer to 700 tons to maintain combat effectiveness. The shortfall was catastrophic. Within days, soldiers were on reduced rations. Within a week, they were starving. Soviet fighters made every flight a gauntlet of death. Yak-9s and La-5s prowled the skies, hunting the slow, lumbering German transports. Ju-52s, flying at barely 250 kilometers per hour, were easy prey. Soviet pilots shot them down by the dozen. Some pilots became aces, racking up kill after kill against the defenseless cargo planes. On the ground, Soviet anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket, firing 85 M37 shells at any aircraft that came within range. Many German planes were destroyed on the airstrips themselves, caught by Soviet artillery fire while unloading. The weather was equally merciless. Blizzards swept across the steppe, grounding entire fleets of aircraft. Snowstorms reduced visibility to zero. Temperatures dropped so low that engines froze, fuel lines iced over, and aircraft had to be kept running constantly or they wouldn't start again. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning, flying through clouds and snow, hoping to find the pocket's tiny airstrips. Many didn't. Dozens of aircraft crashed in the featureless white landscape, their crews freezing to death before rescue could arrive. Between 24 November 1942 and 2 February 1943, the Luftwaffe lost 488 aircraft trying to supply Stalingrad, 266 Ju-52s, 165 He-111s, 42 Ju-86s, 9 FW-200 Condors, 5 He-177s, and 1 Me-323 Gigant. Over 1,000 airmen died. It was an unsustainable loss rate that crippled the Luftwaffe's transport capacity for the rest of the war. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated with terrifying speed. By early December, the cold had become unbearable. Temperatures plunged to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still wearing their standard field uniforms, were not equipped for a Russian winter. The Wehrmacht had planned for a summer campaign, a quick victory before winter arrived. Winter clothing was in short supply, reserved for frontline troops. Most of the men trapped at Stalingrad had only their standard wool greatcoats, inadequate against the Siberian cold. Frostbite became epidemic. Soldiers lost toes, fingers, ears, noses. Some lost entire feet. The medical facilities inside the pocket were overwhelmed. Wounded men lay in overcrowded cellars and ruined buildings, without morphine, without bandages, without heat. Thousands died not from their wounds but from exposure and infection. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia, using hacksaws and knives sterilized over candle flames. Rations shrank every day. By mid-December, each soldier was receiving less than 200 grams of bread per day, supplemented by watery soup made from bones, scraps of meat, and whatever else could be found. Horses were slaughtered for food. When the horses ran out, soldiers ate rats, dogs, even leather boots boiled until they were soft enough to chew. Starvation set in. Men became walking skeletons, too weak to fight, too weak even to stand guard. Discipline began to break down. Cases of theft, insubordination, even suicide increased. Yet through it all, Paulus maintained order. He issued daily reports to higher headquarters detailing the situation, requesting permission to break out, begging for more supplies. But the orders from Hitler never changed. Hold fast. Relief is coming. And for a brief moment, it seemed Hitler might be right. On 12 December 1942, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to relieve the Sixth Army. Manstein was one of Germany's most capable commanders, perhaps the finest operational mind the Wehrmacht possessed. He had been placed in command of the newly formed Army Group Don, tasked with breaking through the Soviet lines and rescuing Paulus. Manstein assembled a powerful strike force, spearheaded by the 6th Panzer Division, the 23rd Panzer Division, and the elite 17th Panzer Division. These units, fresh and well-equipped, attacked from the southwest, smashing into Soviet defenses near the town of Koltnikovo. The panzers advanced rapidly, supported by Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft. Within 3 days, they had advanced nearly 50 kilometers. Soviet resistance stiffened, but the Germans kept pushing. By 19th December, Manstein's spearhead was only 48 kilometers from the pocket. Manstein sent a radio message to Paulus: "Hold on, we are coming. Prepare to break out and link up with our forces." The message was codenamed Thunderclap. If the Sixth Army could break out simultaneously. Why, with Manstein's attack, the two forces could link up and escape together. But Paulus hesitated. Hitler's orders were explicit: hold Stalingrad. Breaking out would mean abandoning the city, abandoning all the heavy equipment, tanks, artillery vehicles, that couldn't be moved quickly. It would mean leaving behind thousands of wounded who couldn't be evacuated. And most importantly, it would mean disobeying the Führer. Paulus sent a message back to Manstein, explaining that his army lacked the fuel to break out. The vehicles had barely enough gasoline for 30 kilometers. They would run dry long before reaching Manstein's forces. He also pointed out that his units were exhausted, under strength, and barely combat effective. A breakout attempt might collapse into chaos. Days passed. Paulus did not move. And then on 24th December, Christmas Eve, the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh Soviet armies, including the elite Second Guards Army, slammed into Manstein's exposed flanks. The German advance stalled, then reversed. Manstein's panzers were driven back, fighting desperately to avoid encirclement themselves. By 29th December, winter storm had failed. The distance between Manstein's forces and the pocket grew to over 200 kilometers. Manstein later wrote bitterly that Paulus should have broken out on his own initiative, orders or no orders. If the Sixth Army had moved on 19th December, even without Hitler's permission, it might have escaped. But Paulus, ever the obedient officer, could not bring himself to defy the Führer. And so the window closed. January 1943 was the final agony. On 10th January, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, a systematic assault designed to crush the pocket once and for all. 7 Soviet armies, over 280,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, attacked from all directions. The assault began with a massive artillery barrage, heavier than anything the Germans had yet experienced. Soviet guns fired for 55 minutes straight, pulverizing German positions. Then the infantry advanced, supported by tanks and ground attack aircraft. The perimeter of the pocket, already shrinking under constant pressure, began to collapse. German units, starved and frozen, fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outgunned 5-1. The Soviets advanced methodically, grinding forward meter by meter, reducing each strongpoint with overwhelming firepower. By 17th January, the Soviets had captured the airfield at Pitomnik, the largest remaining airstrip inside the pocket. This was a catastrophic blow. The airlift, already inadequate, now became almost impossible. The only remaining airstrip was at Gumrak, and it was within range of Soviet artillery. Aircraft trying to land there were shelled mercilessly. Many pilots simply dropped supplies from the air, releasing crates without landing, but most of these supplies fell into Soviet hands or landed in no man's land, unreachable. On 22nd January, Gumrak airfield fell. The airlift was over. The Sixth Army was completely cut off, receiving no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. The pocket had been split in two. The northern section, trapped near the tractor factory, was cut off from Paulus's headquarters in the south. Communication between the two halves broke down. Units began to surrender in large groups. Entire battalions marching towards Soviet lines with their hands raised, too exhausted and starved to resist anymore. On 30th January 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi Party's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a cynical gesture, a last-ditch attempt to bind Paulus to his fate. The message was clear: no German field marshal has ever been captured alive. Throughout Prussian and German history, field marshals who faced defeat had chosen death, suicide, a last heroic charge, anything but surrender. Hitler expected Paulus to do the same. But Paulus did not die. On 31st January, Soviet troops stormed the Univermag department store in the southern pocket, where Paulus had established his final headquarters in the basement. Soviet soldiers descended the stairs cautiously, weapons ready, expecting a final desperate defense. Instead, they found silence. Friedrich Paulus sat at a table, his uniform disheveled, his face gaunt and hollow. Around him sat his staff officers, equally exhausted, equally defeated. There was no dramatic last stand, no heroic final words, just a quiet, bitter acknowledgement that it was over. A Soviet lieutenant approached Paulus and asked, "Are you the commander?" Paulus nodded. The lieutenant radioed his superiors. Within the hour, Soviet General Mikhail Shumilov arrived to formally accept the surrender. Paulus was escorted out of the basement, blinking in the harsh winter sunlight, and taken into captivity. In the northern pocket, General Karl Strecker and the remnants of the 11th Corps held out for 2 more days, fighting street by street, building by building. On 2 February 1943, Strecker too surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. They shuffled through the frozen streets of Stalingrad in long columns, guarded by Soviet soldiers. They were emaciated, hollow-eyed, many barely able to walk. Most were sick: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis. Many had frostbite so severe that their feet had turned black and gangrenous. Soviet guards prodded them forward with rifle butts, herding them toward railway stations, where they would be transported to prisoner-of-war camps deep in Siberia. The conditions in those camps were appalling. Food was scarce, medical care almost non-existent. Prisoners lived in unheated barracks, crammed together in filthy conditions. Disease spread unchecked. The work was brutal: logging, mining, construction, performed in sub-zero temperatures with inadequate clothing. The mortality rate was staggering. Of the 90,000 men captured at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Most died within the first year of captivity. Friedrich Paulus, however, was treated differently. He was valuable propaganda. Stalin understood the significance of capturing a German field marshal, the first in history to surrender. Paulus was held in relative comfort, housed in a villa outside Moscow, interrogated by Soviet intelligence officers. At first, he refused to cooperate, maintaining his dignity as a German officer. But gradually, over months and years, he began to change. In 1944, after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July, Paulus publicly denounced the Nazi regime. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German POWs who opposed Hitler. He made radio broadcasts urging German soldiers to surrender, appeared at press conferences condemning the Nazi leadership. Whether this was genuine conviction or simply a survival strategy remains debated by historians. Some believe Paulus genuinely came to despise Hitler, blaming him for the Stalingrad disaster. Others believe he was a broken man, manipulated by his captors, saying whatever was necessary to survive. Paulus was finally released in 1953 after Stalin's death. He returned not to West Germany but to East Germany, settling in Dresden. The communist government welcomed him, praising him as an anti-fascist hero. But in West Germany, he was despised as a traitor, a coward who had betrayed his comrades by collaborating with the enemy. He lived quietly in Dresden, writing his memoirs, justifying his actions, insisting that he had done his duty as a soldier. He died in 1957, aged 66, a broken and controversial figure, forever haunted by Stalingrad. The battle itself became a symbol, a turning point in the war. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Wehrmacht could be beaten, that the Red Army, despite its horrific losses, possessed the strength and determination to destroy Germany's finest troops. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative passed to the Soviets. They would go on the offensive and never stop until they reached Berlin. For Germany, Stalingrad was a catastrophe from which it never fully recovered. The loss of the Sixth Army, an entire field army, over 250,000 men, was a blow that could not be replaced. The survivors who eventually returned to Germany after the war brought back stories of horror that shattered morale on the home front. The myth that Germany was winning the war crumbled. Goebbels's propaganda machine tried to spin Stalingrad as a heroic last stand, a tale of martyrdom and sacrifice, but the German people knew the truth. They had lost. The ruins of Stalingrad stood silent that winter of 1943, blanketed in snow, the frozen corpses of soldiers from both sides lying where they had fallen. The city, once home to 400,000 people, was now a graveyard. 90% of the buildings had been destroyed. The Volga, which had run red with blood during the battle, was frozen solid, its ice covered with snow. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union rebuilt Stalingrad, brick by brick, as a monument to sacrifice and survival. The city was renamed Volgograd in 1961, though many Russians still refer to it by its wartime name. Monuments were erected: the colossal statue of Mother Russia on Mamiev Kurgan, the grain elevator preserved as a memorial, the ruins of the Gerhardt Mill left standing as a reminder. But the ghosts of Stalingrad never left. They haunt those ruins still, a reminder of what happens when ambition becomes obsession, when duty becomes complicity, when obedience becomes a tomb. Friedrich Paulus, the elegant staff officer who had helped plan the invasion of the Soviet Union, became the first German field marshal to surrender, not because he was weak, but because he was too obedient to be strong. He followed orders when he should have questioned them, trusted authority when he should have trusted his own judgment, and in doing so, led his army into an abyss from which there was no escape. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a reckoning, a moment when the tide of history turned, when the armies of totalitarianism clashed, and one emerged victorious not through ideology, but through sheer determination and sacrifice. The cost was unimaginable: over 2 million casualties, soldiers and civilians on both sides. But the lesson was clear: no army, no matter how powerful, is invincible, and no leader, no matter how charismatic or ruthless, can bend reality to his will. But in another corner of Europe, an equally desperate gamble was about to unfold, one that would test the limits of Allied airborne power and courage. Join us next time as we uncover the story of Operation Market Garden, where British and American paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines in a bold bid to end the war by Christmas. Subscribe now and never miss another untold story from the Second World War.